The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.
And they do invest heavily in AML. And the question is that investment performative? That is, we employ 5,000 AML specialists at the front door, and at the back door, they take in the drug money. You pay enough to get the performative aspects, but not so much that it actually prevents anything bad from happening.
Money make a world go round.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML, compliance, and financial crime to the real world. In Texarkana, Texas, there is a desk perfectly preserved in a museum. It belongs to Wright Papman. He's the man who effectively ended financial anonymity by architecting the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. And by doing so, he turned the financial industry into the first line of defense. Never heard of him? You are not alone. The history of AML has always been reactive. We move so fast to catch the next threat that we rarely look back at how we got here. But that changes today. I'm your host, Marit, CEO of Strise, and in this special 150th episode, we are officially opening the Museum of Anti-Money Laundering. We will be discussing what belongs in a museum of AML, what do these exhibits tell us about the future, and why does this history matter in the real world right now? And to dive into this topic, I'm here with Jessica Cath, managing partner at Thistle Initiative, and Peter Reuter, distinguished university professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Maryland. Welcome to The Laundry, both of you, and welcome back, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to be back.
Really happy to have you both with me for the 150th episode, and that you will be bringing the items that you want to see exhibited. So we are just going to start there. Jess, imagine you're walking into the Museum of AML. There's first the desk that I mentioned. What is then the second object that you want to see there?
Well, I mean, firstly, the museum is just the most awesome museum ever. I think for anyone that works in this space, this is such a good idea. So I wanted to bring something a little bit fun, but also just totally wild. So I know this is quite a recent one, but I've got the fake Buckingham Palace and 10 Downing Street addresses. So I don't know what they would look like in the museum.
Just like a little model, maybe. A little model of Buckingham Palace.
I think so. That's what we were imagining. So a miniature model of Buckingham Palace and a miniature 10 Downing Street. And the reason I'm bringing these, of course, is last year, the FCA in the UK fined Monzo a lot of money. It was 21 and a bit million for some of their serious failings in their anti-financial crime framework. And some of that linked back to, of course, where our now king lives in Buckingham Palace.
In many situations, the form was automatically overwritten with low-risk default, regardless of what the actual data said. Let me give you a couple of real examples from the case file. So someone listed their home address as 10 Downing Street. That's literally the UK Prime Minister's residence. Another used the address of Monzo's own office headquarters. Neither of these were flagged. There were no alerts, no blocks, no follow-ups. These accounts were onboarded like anyone else.
That all boils down to the fact that they weren't verifying customer addresses, which is ultimately a very simple part of financial crime prevention. And ultimately, if anyone lives at Buckingham Palace other than the king, it's a pretty implausible address to have as a customer engaging with Monzo. So if you or I were onboarding with Monzo and said we were living at Buckingham Palace, that's pretty implausible. So that's why I'm bringing it today.
I think it's a good item to bring, and I can also imagining all of the financial crime fighters going into this museum, stopping in front of it and thinking, oh my God, it was so ridiculous back then when we didn't even verify addresses and we let customers open an account with the Buckingham Palace and Downing Street registered. I mean, I think it's a great item to bring to the museum. I wrote a letter in the Financial Times that this Monzo fine was essentially end of like fintech exceptionalism, and that regulators needed to start treating neobanks as same as the big boys. So I think it's a very good item to bring.
Yeah, it was a really interesting piece because ultimately it showed that they had scaled rapidly and suddenly they had so many customers and a lot of transactions going through their systems and tools, but all of their controls had not kept pace with that growth. So when you start comparing them to the big banks, who have, of course, had their problems and their challenges, but they have been looking at their systems and processes whereas Monzo had scaled so rapidly and hadn't had the opportunity to look back and think, hang on a second, let's go back and have a look at our onboarding controls and let's have a look at the connected, enhanced due diligence that we're going to be doing and look at our customer risk assessment methodologies and all of the monitoring that comes off the back of that after onboarding. And it's this really simple point where I think that the basic point around KYC had been forgotten in amongst the growth, in amongst all of the amazing growth that they were experiencing. They'd forgotten that actually the whole point of KYC is to actually know who your customers are. And if you strip that back and you think, is it realistic that my customer is going to be living here at Buckingham Palace? And some of them even onboarded with Monzo's own address, which is again very, very implausible. It's just stripping it back down to the basics to remember that when we're talking about anti-financial crime prevention, the simplest thing to ask is, does the customer storyline make sense? And that got kind of forgotten in the challenges of hyper growth, which of course has been very, very difficult.
Peter, what do you think about the Jessica's entry to the museum, and what would you be talking about standing in front of it?
So just let me pick up on the Buckingham Palace and the address issue. I mean, it's a lovely exhibit and it makes its point, but I'm not sure I agree with Jessica that these are growing pains. I mean, if you read about, I was just looking last night, sort of preparing for this podcast, looking at something from the Permanent Subcommittee of Investigation of the US Senate, I think around 2010, what may have been something related to HSBC. And, the bank was clearing American Express travelers' checks worth $500,000 each day for a lot of days for some, unknown entity. I mean, it had a name, but that was all it did. I mean, the fintech expansion may have made this sort of particularly blatant, but gee, here, the great banks of the world have almost all been caught doing something that's not really much different from what you describe here. I have an almost English taste for irony, and I just love reading, reports on these kinds of things because you can't believe that these organizations with 1,000 AML officials just let this stuff go on.
Jessica, back to the addresses. In the UK, that has been such a big topic because you could just register whatever address in company's house and, the corporate filing registry. So it was not just Monzo, it was the kind of entire system, you could say, that you could register a business to any address. And, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act in 2023 was written to help kind of combat this. Is your kind of item in the museum linked to even not just Monzo, but the wider sort of issue in the UK?
Yeah, you're right. So the company's house issue in the UK has been a main challenge for quite a long time. And that's why it's going through a bit of a revolution, although possibly the world's slowest revolution when it comes to dealing with some of these challenges. So you're right that businesses can be set up in the UK with different people, with different individuals, with different addresses, which makes it very, very tricky for banks or fintechs or any financial services firm who relies on company's house to be verifying corporate registry information to then cross-check to make sure, okay, this is when onboarding this company, I'm going to look at the registry because that's my source of truth. And of course, the source of truth is not true. So this is why Companies House is going through a bit of an overhaul and an uplift. So we're seeing, of course, identity and verification requirements coming out for directors and connected parties of businesses. We're on a slow journey with bringing Companies House up to speed, which is, again, part of that process. But if you look globally, at least the UK has an accessible registry, which plenty
True,
of
very
jurisdictions
true.
don't. So it's, we've got something that's certainly not perfect, and it is on a journey, which is a good thing, but it is a bit of a slow piece. And I will quickly come back on Peter's point around whether or not this is just a growing pain for Monzo. And I think, we work a lot with fast growing firms, and they often have to make a lot of very conscious decisions around when you're growing, what do you invest in at what points? And I think they made the wrong decisions around investing or not investing in certain automated controls over the other. And that was part of their growing pain, but also part of their governance and maturity journey, where they were making perhaps the wrong conscious decision at the wrong time. And the address verification point, which looking back looks so obvious, was an easy one for them to not see at the time because they didn't have the structures, the governance, some of the MI reporting in place. Now, when you compare them to a big bank, they should have a lot of these in place. So whether or not that's more of a conscious decision in big banks that have these problems is another question. But for Monzo, I think it was a really, really delicate balance because of the fast growth, which made those decisions not overlooked, but more difficult to spot as they were growing. But on the Companies House point, I'm really, really hopeful that we'll see this start to adjust and change in the future.
On how many company boards does Mickey Mouse still sit at Company House?
Yeah, it's
Quite a few.
still a few. All right. So we walked past Buckingham Palace and 10 Downing Street, and now we're walking further into the exhibition. What do you want to see there, Peter? What is an entry to the Museum of AML?
My first entry is the box that was designed for taking cash to a bank in Mexico. It was designed by drug trafficking organizations and had a particular shaped window for its tellers. And it was so much the bank for laundering drug cash in Mexico that the traffickers had designed this box to fit into that window perfectly.
Here is how bad it was. At one point, Mexican law enforcement recorded a cartel leader on a wiretap saying HSBC was the place to launder money. And the Sinaloa cartel deposited so much money in their bank that the cartel designed special cash boxes to fit HSBC's teller windows, which is surprisingly considerate in a way. After all, who hasn't been stuck in a teller line behind some guy trying to stuff a blood-soaked duffel full of cash through the window? Finally, a cartel that thinks about other people's time.
What I love about this is it sort of reminds you of how makes the point that it's so institutionalized. I mean, it's not that there's somebody out there, some rogue teller who is laundering money for, a few bad people. It's that it really was the bank that was known to handle the money, and then HSBC, despite the fact that its own AML chief told them about this problem, went ahead and bought that bank and ended up paying dearly.
Yeah, I mean, this is a story that we've covered a lot on the show. We've had even someone from the prosecution side on it, and we all know that it ended with like HSBC were fined 1.9 billion in 2012, and it's of course a well-known story in the industry. But it's also just crazy that why did no one took a look at the briefcase-sized windows and realize, hey, there's something wrong here. Like by design, there is something wrong. If it fits so perfectly.
I want to make a point here, which is, it's not as though these things are the result of rogue employees. I mean, the board knew about this. They bought it knowingly. And that's almost all of the big fines represent payments for decisions that very high level officials, if not the board itself, made. And none of this is secret. It may be maybe illegal, but it's not secret.
Jess, what do you think about what would you be talking about when looking at this exhibit?
So I think this is a really interesting one, and I'm going to be very careful actually about what I say because I've had a lot of experience in this particular case. So I've got to just be a little bit careful here. But the bank itself, it's pretty unbelievable that this took place, and it's amazing how the values that went through those windows, and of course the kind of willful blindness around what was happening, and everyone knows that. But I actually would rather focus on what happened afterwards. And that was really important because it set the bank on a complete turning point in terms of looking at its operations. It's resetting all of its global standard frameworks. And they entered into a huge remediation exercise in order to try and get it right. Now, nobody can get this 100% right. There will always be fraud, AML, financial crimes that take place through financial services. But what they need to do is to build a proportionate framework that exists in alignment with the risks that they face and to make sure that that's operating effectively. So to do that, they really did rebuild everything ground up, policies, procedures, looking at their risk profiles, building their risk assessments out. So whilst it was a very serious and interesting topic, which then set almost the global standard on the fines that firms are going to be facing. But it also set the expectation around what firms have to do off the back of it. And that's the bit that I would rather focus on, to look at how they're rebuilding things after having something like this take place.
Jessica, I mean, I'm not always a naysayer, but I'll practice that this morning. It's not as though 2012 is a turning point in major bank AML scandals. I mean, the biggest ones come well after that. I mean, Danske Bank is the biggest of them all. And that comes around 2018, 19. HSBC may have cleaned up its act. I don't follow these things closely enough to know whether they're being found again to have made major violations. But so many of these major banks have not just done it once, but after having paid some big fine, they do it again. HSBC may have cleaned itself up. It was a big scandal, but it's not as though major banks are showing that they've learned their lesson in general.
So I come at it because we work a lot with financial services firms. I have to come at it from a very commercial perspective. So for me, it's not necessarily about them getting a slapped wrist and learning their lesson. It's more about the fact that risk profiles change, circumstances change. And whilst, of course, there are always instances where people are willfully blind to a problem, and that is a problem, there are also instances where the controls have not kept pace with a new product launch or a new risk that has appeared or changing in fraud profiles. And that's the bit that we are often seeing with some of our fines recently, is it's more around, as the business grows and changes, the systems and controls don't keep pace with that. And quite rightly so, they're receiving fines and there are problems. But that's the bit where firms need to make sure that it's about building a proportionate framework to deal with the risks that they face. And of course, looking at the HSBC case, it wasn't a proportionate framework for the risks that they were facing because they were dealing with a whole load of drug cartels in Mexico. But for me, it's really just looking sensibly and proportionately at what the risks are and building those frameworks. Because also when speaking to financial services firms, they are doing a lot. Yes, there are continued fines, but they are doing a lot. They're putting a lot of money, time, and effort into building these frameworks. But they are not the police. And they are not the intelligence services that need to be supporting them as well. So it's getting the balance right. If we look at how anti-financial crime framework should work across financial services and law enforcement, they need to come together. And sometimes it's looking at or pushing everything back to the financial services firms is the real challenge here without recognizing how much they are indeed putting into a lot of their frameworks.
Okay. But change is permanent. That is, it's not as though we're moving to some static equilibrium. If they have trouble handling change, they will have trouble forever. So they had better learn how to make proportionate changes promptly. If I think about the Danske Bank, nothing novel there. They were dealing with very traditional kinds of laundering activities in high risk areas. And over 200 billion euros was thought to have sort of flowed through that ought to have been signaled. I accept that change presents a management challenge for AML, but they're always going to be facing change. And secondly, I think a lot of these scandals are not from novel innovations, but just decisions not to take it seriously, despite the fact, and you're absolutely right. I mean, they do invest heavily in AML. And the question is that investment performative? That is, it's important that HSBC be able to say, we employ 5,000 AML specialists at the front door, and at the back door, they take in the drug money. I'm in no way accusing HSBC of doing that, but just that's a strategy. You pay enough to get the performative aspects, but not so much that it actually prevents anything bad from happening.
Let's talk about the HSBC fine and what it intended to do. But one of the things it did not do was to kill the drug trade and the movement of dirty money between the US and Mexico. As we've seen this week or last week, there's been huge real world events connected to that fact. So it's also okay. Even if that fine, or let's say if that fine or that suitcase is in the museum, we still are, and HSBC redid their policies from the ground up. It comes to show that, the problem just doesn't go away. And as Jessica says, the banks do really invest, but they cannot be the police and the law enforcement and the intelligence all at once. So it kind of shows that the financial crime doesn't necessarily go away, even though we really want to try to solve it. So that's also just some thoughts that I had on that.
Now you're more on my grounds. So this is the question of what AML is aiming to accomplish. If you listen to FATF, its goal is to reduce or prevent money being laundered. That, of course, is nonsense. Money laundering is simply a tool that we use, like we use conspiracy, as a device to go after people who are breaking the laws and causing global bads, kleptocrats or drug dealers, anyone like that. And the test is not really whether there's less laundering so much as it is whether we're able to do a better job at controlling the predicate crimes using AML. And it may be, I'm skeptical, but it may be that money laundering is now more expensive, and that's a deterrent effect. So even if it goes on, it may be that there's less of it, and that AML has accomplished its goal.
At least it should make it harder for people to do this. Can't get enough of the laundry? Not only are we giving you a weekly podcast dishing out insights and learnings on the biggest topics in AML and compliance, but now we have our very own newsletter. Fresh Laundry with me, Marit, is a place for hot takes, looks behind the scenes on the latest episodes, and the best recommendations in news, articles, podcasts, and more. Find the link in the episode description. Let's clean up your inbox with some fresh laundry. We need to move on to the third entry of the Museum of AML, and that is what I would bring to the museum. Now, this particular item needs actually a little bit more space than what you guys brought, because I want to bring a sanctioned Russian oligarch super yacht, and specifically the 58-meter long super yacht that's currently sitting in Canary Wharf in London and is currently costing the British taxpayer money on its maintenance.
It's become a symbol of the crackdown on Russian money. The first super yacht to be detained in UK waters, the Fee has now sat in London's Canary Wharf for more than 2 months. £40 million worth of luxury the captain insists has been bought with clean money. We're told the owner is a Russian businessman who made his wealth in civil engineering. The detention order names the owner as Sergei Naumenko. He's not on any sanctions list, but legally speaking that doesn't matter. A connection to Russia is enough for the yacht to be held. The Transport Secretary said the yacht belonged to a Putin crony who's hiding behind a complex paper trail. The boat's registered to a company in St Kitts and Nevis and carries the Maltese flag.
So the backstory here is that in 2022, the UK government seized this £38 million yacht in London to show that they were being tough on Russia. The Transport Secretary even filmed a TikTok video in front of it, calling the owner a friend of Putin, and even though there was no tangible evidence that this was true. And the owner, a Russian billionaire businessman, has sued twice to get his boat back. And now it's just sitting there at Canary Wharf. It's not being used, not being maintained, so it's getting into all kinds of problems with that. So it's been trapped in a London dock for over 3 years with no end in sight, and I think it should rather go into the museum. So because of sanctions, the crew isn't allowed to perform basic repairs to fix fire alarms or anything. And it's even filled with diesel, so it doesn't even have a risk of catching fire and causing huge fires. So yeah, now it's just sitting there rotting, losing millions of dollars. And I think you could go into the museum instead. Jess, I don't know, have you been down to Canary Wharf to take a look at this thing?
I have indeed seen it, and it is starting to look a little worse for wear than when it did back when it first docked there. But this is a really, really interesting one, and it's a great kind of visual representation of all of the challenges that come along with sanctions compliance and trying to make sure we can get to the bottom of who owns what. When we had the Russian invasion, we had this whole host of new sanctions requirements that came out. And it was pretty easy to roll out those sanctions requirements, but it was very, very hard for people on the ground in financial services firms. And then, of course, actually going and finding those assets. It was very, very hard to actually start to work through all of the really opaque structures, look at all of the actual ownership. And it comes back to our first story as well, to look at the actual ownership that's been kind of obscured and missing for years. And this was just a really kind of visual representation, and still is, down on those docks in Canary Wharf by all of our HSBC offices in Canary Wharf, for example, a great visual representation of how those sanctions challenges are still very much here today.
And I mean, this is an asset that has been seized, but have we actually learned anything about asset seizure since the invasion of Ukraine?
So, I mean, asset seizures are still very, very challenging. I mean, again, from my perspective, I'm coming at it from the financial services firms themselves, where their role is to enact a sanctioned regime, identify and make sure they freeze accounts, and then it's about making sure you understand the ownership structure behind it. But then actually going and seizing assets comes down to things like law enforcement, and that's where we need the connection between the two. And asset seizure, in order to get it right, is all about speed and coordination between all the different parties that are involved. So speed is very difficult because the sanction is announced, then we've got the screening processes, then you've got people finding the structures, and then you've got finding the asset itself. So actually the speed in order to go and seize that asset is very difficult. And then again, the coordination between compliance, regulators, law enforcement, again, that's a challenge. But we've learned a lot, actually, and the speed in which I've seen firms respond to, or now able to respond to, changes in sanctions regimes is much stronger than when Russia first invaded Ukraine.
I think that the yacht should be the home of the museum. It's really wonderful to be a floating museum you could take to lots of countries over the course of a year and expose a broader audience. But can I offer another exhibit for the museum?
Yeah, sure.
Right, okay. So these are Hessian bags.
Hessian bags?
Yes, Hessian. They're bags that you use for bundling wheat or something like that. It doesn't matter that they're Hessian. They're things, just bags that you would use to hold money. And these were the bags that NatWest tellers used to stuff in the money that spilled out from the garbage bags. There was a jeweler, a mid-sized jeweler, 15 million pounds a year, that managed to deposit 290 million pounds over, I think, 5 years at NatWest in a particular branch. And the jeweler staff would bring in these garbage bags, black garbage bags, I believe they were described as, with cash in them. And often the garbage bag would break, and the NatWest officials were prepared. They had these bags, described as Hessian bags, into which they then stuffed the money that had spilled out of the garbage bags. And they did this for years. And NatWest somehow did not think that there was a suspicious activity here. And so literally never reported any of that. And I think those bags, again, sort of represent the institutionalization of a money laundering scheme. So everyone was ready for it. The money was predictably coming in, and they were there with the bags.
Yeah, definitely something that should belong in a museum of AML. Maybe with the money in it would be also cool. But before we end this episode, there's been a few submissions to the Museum of AML by the Laundry community. So I'm going to dish out some quickfire questions of the suggested entries we got, and then we will decide if they make it into the exhibition. So I'll read these out, and then you guys will let me know if you think they should go in. So Luma Sitani suggests that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act from 1977 has to be there, considering the extent of their use within the sanctions space.
So I think from my perspective, whilst I'm not sure how this would look in the museum, this act,
maybe just a copy of it. I think like copy of it in paper, and it would be like on a little, where you would display like an
Perfect.
old book kind of thing. It would lay there, and you could read maybe the first page,
got it.
and then the rest in a big, yeah.
That would look perfect. But of course, it's the kind of backbone of US sanctions. It's an incredibly, it's not a flashy piece, but it's foundational. So yes, I think so. I think it should be at the museum.
Yeah, I agree. Especially now that sanctions has become such a wildly known tool on the general public, for the general public as well. It should be in there. We had another one from Friedrich Lindenberg. He says, gotta add a little fun. I want to have Obiang's seized Michael Jackson jacket in there. And the backstory here is, of course, that a fraudster had then purchased several of Michael Jackson's items, including a jacket and a glove. And he was allowed then to keep this item after his assets was seized. In the museum, in the exhibition, or not?
Seems a little stretched.
I think this one would look lovely in the museum as well. I think it's because it's linked to wider corruption scandals. I don't know the details of this case, but I know it's linked to, I think, the son of the Equatorial Guinea dictator. So it's got a really interesting connection. It's got these really, really good connections in with, wider corruption issues. And there were a number of items from memory connected into that. We had a Ferrari in there and other things. So who knows? It could be a wider exhibit in itself, this one.
It's also like a fun little crossroads of where financial crime and like pop culture kind of goes hand in hand.
Exactly.
Okay, and then the next one from Denise Rudich suggests that the 1989 G7 declaration that created the FATF should be in the museum. I guess, again, a bunch of papers then. That's how the exhibition item would look.
No, I think that absolutely that's a foundational document, and sort of unexpected. That wasn't thought to be the major product of that particular G7 meeting, and it turned out it created this permanent institution that no one thought of as being more than an emergency response at the time. Definitely.
I have to agree. It's a foundational piece, and it's got to be in there. And of course, if it came from the wonderful Denise, then it's got to be in there.
And I actually didn't know that it wasn't intended as like a big thing from that G7 convention. But it's interesting that these things then later has had such a big influence. But yeah, so I agree, it should go in there. And then final one, this is from the Laundry's own Robin Laika, my co-host, and he says, the original Satoshi Manifesto. It represents the biggest disconnect between intent and reality in the tech history. Satoshi wanted to build a permissionless utopia, but criminals saw it and thought, great, unfreezable money. It belongs in a museum just for the lesson that you can design the tech, but you can never design how humans will actually use it.
That's very imaginative. I think that's an important entry and not what I would have thought of. Robin's right.
This one was very, very interesting to me because we do a lot of work with the crypto and digital assets sector, and a lot of people see what came from that manifesto and, of course, the burgeoning of the wider crypto ecosystem as a really easy way of moving illicit money. And of course, we do see a lot of illicit money going through crypto, but then we do see a lot of illicit money going through cash still and through some traditional means. And if you actually look at the blockchain itself, it allows for greater transparency and better tracing than some of the traditional banking system. The challenges are actually more around when that money goes to an exchange that doesn't have very good KYC, which again is something that could happen in the traditional financial services sector too. That's where you can't actually find who owns that wallet. So I don't know about this one because it's setting the tone for the crypto industry when actually I've seen some interesting, pretty good stuff happening here. Of course, there are still challenges. It's a newish industry, but I've seen some really exciting, good things happening in the crypto space as well for anti-financial crime.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with I think it should be in there. There have been and are a lot of issues related to financial crime in the crypto industry, and especially since it has this sort of the intent versus sort of some of the outcomes. So I'll keep it in there. But that brings the spin of the laundry to an end. Jess and Peter, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
I'm at the University of Maryland. You can find me on a webpage there, easily enough.
So you can always find me at Jessica Cath on LinkedIn or the Thistle Initiatives.co.uk website.
Money makes a world go round.
And thanks to everyone who was listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, check out our back catalog. And also, if you enjoyed these entries of the Museum of AML, this might not be the last episode we make about this museum. So if you have any ideas that what should be in it, please do reach out to us on LinkedIn, on social media. And also, please do share this episode with a colleague or in a group chat. It really helps people to find us. Your host for this episode was me, Marit. Our producer was Matthew. Our editor was Dominic. And The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise. Visit strise.ai for more information. See you next time.
Money makes a world go round. It makes a world go round.
None of that information links the owner of the boat to any position in Russian politics, to Mr. Putin or any other political aspiration.
And you believe that?
I do. I've known him for 11 years.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, your AML automation software for faster onboarding, smarter monitoring, and growth without overhead.